on to the business of the evening. So thank you all. Again, this is our 5th Salon event. We started last May, did 4 events through October of last year, finishing with the immersive Frankenstein event, which included a presentation of the play Frankenstein with the IRT's version of that, and it was a smashing success. A lot of fun. We're going to be doing the immersive event too again this year. But for tonight, we have Dr. Richard Gunderman. As you may know or may not know, Richard is a Wabash man. I think received his undergraduate degree from Wabash College at Tocqueville.
We're sorry.
So I said that for all of you.
We're sorry.
I'll let Dr. Gunderman defend himself.
Unless the game's been up, all right.
And of course, as you also know from the invitation, he is an MD, a very accomplished MD, and has a PhD through the Committee of Social Thought at the University of Chicago. A physician and highly accomplished professor at IU. He's also a very prolific author and a deep thinker. I've known Richard for a few years. I had the opportunity several years ago when I was a Liberty Fund. In my brief interactions with him, I've come to know Dr. Gunderman as a man with an insatiable appetite or desire for learning. And as mentioned in the invitation, he has even deeper respect for the capacity of humans to learn and connect, which is what these events are all about. They're an opportunity for an open dialogue, exchange, and ability to ideas. It's my pleasure to introduce friend, an accomplished physician, and a good liberal arts man, Dr. Professor Richard Gunderman.
Good evening. It's a treat to be here. I think I'm not here to convince you anything, not trying to tell you what to think, but I do want to invite you to think along with me. As we'll see, some forces in contemporary society may be placing our capacity to think for ourselves and with each other through conversation. That may be at some risk today. Does anybody recognize these two individuals? Yeah, the guy on the left is George Orwell, Eric Blair, and the guy on the right is Aldous Huxley. We'll come back to that. So those of us who had a chance read several things for tonight, passages from Tocqueville's Democracy in America, Federalist 51 by our 4th president, James Madison, little Jimmy Madison, right? Shortest president, U.S. history at 5 feet 4 inches. An excerpt from the Lincoln-Douglas debates, the First Amendment to our Constitution, Mill on Liberty, Neil Postman. I want to go through those at breakneck pace. When was the Federalist published? Yeah, that's good. And there were 85 of them, and the authors were? J. Madison and Hamilton, exactly right. And how many words do the Federalist Papers amount to? The answer is 168,000 words. The Federalist Papers, produced over the course of a few months by people who had a lot to say, who were trying to get the state of New York to ratify the Constitution. That contrasts pretty sharply with social media. Here you see X or Twitter, where messages used to be limited to 140 characters. And I've got a couple of quotes here from a tweeter. One, sorry losers and haters, but my IQ is one of the highest, and you all know it. Please don't feel stupid or insecure. It's not your fault. And the second one, of course, is despite the constant negative press, Covfefe. Causes? Coverage? Anyway, it's a very spontaneous and not always terribly deeply thought out or edited means of communication, in contrast to, say, the Federalist Papers, and that might be significant. So Madison thought the power surrendered by us, the people, needed to be divided in a government so that the parts of government would jealously guard their prerogatives and hold each other in check. But of course, Madison was also worried about what we've come to call the tyranny of the majority. You could either have a single authority like a monarch, or you could have a society composed of many parts, interests, and classes that would preserve the rights of minorities. So, in essence, our civil rights might be secured by a multiplicity of interests. Where the stronger can readily unite and suppress the weaker, anarchy will win. So we need diverse points of view expressed well in fora that many, if not all of us, have an opportunity to participate in. Of course, there's much more that could be said about Federalist 51 and certainly the Federalist Papers, but we need people, and especially thought leaders in our community, together on a regular basis in forums like this, seated around tables like this, with opportunities to chat with one another. Without that, democracy is in peril. I turn now to the Lincoln-Douglas debates. When were those? 1858 is exactly right. You'll remember it's the campaign for the U.S. Senate, of course, won by Stephen Douglas. Abraham Lincoln becomes a national figure when those debates are published verbatim and in toto in newspapers all over the country. How long did those debates last? The answer is 3 hours. People stood in open air under the sky for 3 hours to hear Lincoln and Douglas go at it. This, of course, is a nice statue depicting those debates. And I just remind you that their debates were reproduced in full in newspapers all over the country. This, on the other hand, is the social media situation. What do you suppose the numbers next to the year stand for? That's the average length of sound bites from U.S. presidential campaigns. In 1963, they were 43 seconds long. Doesn't sound much compared to 3 hours, right? But these days, they're about 7 seconds long. That's how much of the words of the candidates you typically get in the news media. That's a problem. Lincoln said, and of course Tocqueville would agree, that public sentiment is far more important than the laws. I don't know if you agree with that, but public sentiment is more important than the laws, partly because whoever molds public sentiment can make the laws. And of course, Lincoln accuses Douglas of only perpetuating slavery by blowing out the love of liberty. Specifically, Douglas, he said, was trying to blow out our moral rights. He said the Negro wasn't mentioned in the Declaration. He said people are free to choose slavery. And what Douglas says when he doesn't care if slavery is voted up or down. He's fostering a kind of detachment, a kind of apathy that Lincoln believes is a fundamental threat to our democratic culture. Next, we move to the Bill of Rights, proposed in 1789, adopted 2 years later. 10 amendments. According to scholars, the greatest influence over the Bill of Rights was, in fact, laws that already existed in the several states. How do Americans do on the 5 components of the First Amendment? The answer is about a third of us don't know any of the 5, about 40% of us know 1, and only 3% of us could identify all 5. If that is a cornerstone of our democratic culture, the fact most of us are unfamiliar with it poses a grave threat to our democratic order. Of course, those 5 components, Congress won't make a law respecting the establishment of religion, prohibiting the free exercise thereof, abridging freedom of the press or speech, the right of people to peaceably assemble, and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Now, just touch briefly on bills on liberty. Again, these are readings which all of us had the opportunity to do prior to our convening here this evening. So John Stuart Mill in 1859, just days after the death of his wife, who he credits with formulating a lot of the ideas the text contains, Mills on Liberty talks about the struggle between authority and liberty and says that the tyranny of government is less dangerous than the tyranny of the majority. What's that? That's in the first decade of this century, the polarization of ideas presented on major television networks. The idea is that the television networks, by and large, have come more and more to resemble echo chambers. And if each of us get our news from only one preferred provider, we're not hearing both sides, or in fact always, the multiple perspectives on any question. So Mill said anybody who knows only one side of the case knows little. We have to hear the other side, and we need to hear it from the people who sincerely subscribe to it. Some of you have read Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, the highest theology, so to speak. Aquinas begins every question in that massive text by considering the objections that are raised to his position, and very often he presents those objections better than his opponents. We've got to see multiple sides of the question. So now we come to the main event. Alexis de Tocqueville, who lived from 1805 to 1859, came from an aristocratic family. It's important to know Tocqueville's grandfather was killed, executed, and Tocqueville's parents barely escaped the guillotine themselves. Tocqueville later, for a short time, becomes a legislator, but this is somebody who saw his family, his property, his very life threatened by government. So you all know he comes with Gustave de Beaumont to the United States in 1831. You can see the path of their travels throughout the United States and Canada. Notice he didn't make it into Indiana, but he was in the Ohio River between Indiana and Kentucky. And I gotta tell you, Tocqueville spends a lot of time in New York, a lot of time in Boston, a lot of time in Philadelphia. I think Tocqueville felt he learned more, not from those major metropolises, but from our neighbors, the people of Ohio. That's where he felt he got the deepest insight into the essence of American democracy. Now, of course, he comes here to study prisons, penitentiaries, but he spends 10 months in the United States and Canada. And he publishes 3 great works, which I eagerly commend to your attention. One is on the penitentiary system in the United States, in which he basically argues that thousands of prisoners can be held in check by a few guards because the prisoners are forbidden to speak to one another. Silence as one of the great tools of despots. Tocqueville's really amazed that people stay in line. The reason is they can't talk to each other. What might you, if you were a despot, want to do? Basically detach us from one another. Stop us from communicating at all, or maybe turn our conversation into something all but meaningless. The big works by Tocqueville were Sir Democracy in America, 1835, Volume 1, 1840, Volume 2. And then another great work which I commend to your attention is his The Old Regime and the Revolution, basically thinking about the revolution in France. A lot of people read Edmund Burke. Unfortunately, not many people read Tocqueville, who in my view is equally worthy of our attention. These are, of course, Tocqueville's comments on his own handwritten manuscript of Democracy in America. So the key thing for Tocqueville, I won't read this, is associations. In France, anywhere you see the government. In England, anywhere you see a great lord. In the United States, he says, you find an association. I might append the word voluntary association. Americans get together, much as we're together right now in this room, voluntarily to talk to each other, to work on problems of mutual concern. And this is, from Tocqueville's point of view, the real laboratory of democracy. It's not what happens in the chambers of the legislature, either here in Indiana or nationally. It's in local communities. That is the real cradle of democratic citizenship, the people with the character necessary to govern themselves. So Tocqueville basically argues that our freedoms require a defense against despotism. Political association. Are you a Democrat? Are you a Republican, independent, a libertarian, member of the Green Party? From Tocqueville's point of view, that is the lesser part of your identity as a democratic citizen. What happens in the realm of politics is less important than what happens outside the realm of politics in terms of protecting and promoting our democratic culture. So Tocqueville says in France, people turn to the government. In the United States, people form voluntary associations. In fact, from his point of view, without the right habit of association, our independence is in jeopardy, our civilization itself is in jeopardy, and there's a danger, it is fine, that the United States might relapse into something we might call barbarism. The problem, of course, is that forming associations can be difficult. First, we have to know each other. And these days, we're all familiar with Robert Putnam's bowling alum. Americans are a lot more isolated than we used to be. The amount of time we spend in the physical presence of one another has declined precipitously over the last 20 years, and that was supercharged during the COVID pandemic. I gotta tell you, the nation's largest medical schools, the Indiana University School of Medicine, and our students, especially in the first 2 years, spend a great deal of time learning to be a doctor, hunkered down by themselves in front of a computer screen, listening asynchronously to a lecture that might have been delivered 1, 2, or even 3 years ago. I don't know what you think about that, but I can tell you as a physician, that does not strike me as the appropriate cradle for developing the next generation of physicians. And from Tocqueville's point of view, if we reduce association, we become helpless. What do I do if I'm mad about some aspect of my patient's care? I pick up the phone, call the CEO of the hospital or health system. I say, this is unacceptable. It's got to be fixed. And I slam down the phone in rage. All I can do is appeal to a higher authority. I don't know what to do as a problem solver on my own. That can-do attitude is for Tocqueville the absolute essence of the habits of mind and heart on which democracy depends. If we don't feel we can address our own problems, typically together, not as individuals, then democracy is in serious peril. So from Tocqueville's point of view, if the government tries to keep alive and renew the circulation of feelings, it becomes a tyranny. The United States of America cannot teach citizenship. It cannot teach Sunday school. It can't operate the Girl Scouts or the Boy Scouts, because if it did, it would become a tyranny. And of course, to Tocqueville, it's even worse that the government tries to suppress the circulation of ideas. So from Tocqueville's point of view, there's nothing, his words stop behind, nothing that deserves more attention than our intellectual and moral associations. I take it together, we are at least a temporary intellectual and moral association here in this room right now. We're drawn together by ideas, by acquaintances, by loyalties. Here is where democracy is born, where it's nurtured and develops to full maturity in organizations like this. From Tocqueville's point of view, association is the mother of all sciences. The mother of all sciences is association, and civilization requires that the art of association must grow and improve. What are you doing as a citizen and a neighbor to grow and improve the art of association? If you care what kind of world your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren will inherit, you need to be actively engaged in growing and developing the art of association. So we've got to learn to join together. By the way, I'm switching out a newspaper. Some of you will recall that was the second half of our Tocqueville meeting for tonight. The newspaper industry doesn't appear to be thriving. It may be failing to thrive. It may be even worse off than that. And that was the organ Tocqueville knew of in his day. That was the medium through which people could get to know each other and join together in associations. We need to get to know each other, join together. Only a newspaper can drop the same idea into thousands of minds at once. And if there were no newspapers, says Tocqueville, there would be no common activity. To have any power, we, the many, must unite. We need to find a common purpose, enable the execution of our common designs. We need to realize that we are not alone, that we can meet and unite, and when we do so, we can achieve what I might call synergy. Our efforts could be more than the sum of their parts. So for Tocqueville, civilization means a few people are in charge. Local authority means many people are in charge. To unite those local people, we need newspapers. And he says that is even more important than the freedom of the press, that we stay informed and cooperate with one another. In fact, from his point of view, the number of newspapers reflects the need of human beings to communication and combination. A newspaper is an association of individual readers. What newspapers do you read? How much time do you spend per day, per week, per month, per year reading a local newspaper? Hopefully the answer is a lot, but I'm concerned that many of our fellow citizens and neighbors might not give the same answer. From his point of view, the newspaper's survival proves that association is alive in its readers. So that's a little bit on democracy in America. I'm going to touch now on the last of Tocqueville's three great works we'll discuss tonight, which is the penitentiary system. Anybody recognize that image? That's a real place. What is that? That's the panopticon, from Greek, meaning what? Yeah, pan means all, opticon, eye or seeing. So a guard in that central courthouse can look at all the prisoners. None of the prisoners know who the guard is looking at, but you could keep many people under surveillance. Big Brother is watching, I guess, to put it in Orwellian terms. Despotism, says Tocqueville, sees isolation as the best guarantor of its permanence. Isolate citizens and neighbors from one another. Enforce silence. Remember I said, Tocqueville went, for example, to Sing Sing, and was a brand new prison at that time, very impressed that these prisoners were kept in line because they can never speak to one another. Basically, it was a complete destruction of association. It was Tocqueville's model of despotism for the rest of his life, a place where people are atomized, fragmented, disconnected, each in of our own solitary confinement, hunkered down in front of the television or our laptop computers or our cell phones. You see the images, right? 6, 8, 10 young people, maybe even members of a family seated together at a table, each one looking down at his or her own cell phone. No conversation taking place. So for Tocqueville, there are two kinds of science. One is where you can hear a pin drop, but the other is the roaring silence. We are bombarded with information. We live in a kind of information age. The din of the information transfer has never been nearly as loud in human history. But the problem, of course, is it functions as a kind of silence because we can't hear ourselves think and we can't really hear what anyone else is saying. How many minutes does the average American spend on their cell phone? 275 minutes. We look at our cell phones 96 times a day. There are people in this room right now looking at their cell phones. We can't stop. We're addicted, right? I need another it. And by the way, if you add that up, that's the equivalent of 65 days a year. Looking down at that tiny screen, feeling like I'm staying abreast of what's happening in the world. I'm a responsible citizen of the state of Indiana, the United States of America, humanity, because I'm always on top of what's happening. But in point of fact, in remaining on top of what's new and contemporary, very often we lose the thread of our most precious cultural inheritance. C.S. Lewis said, you know what the problem with new books is? They prevent us from reading the old books. And unfortunately, particularly among the young, the reading of old books is becoming a highly endangered species. Just some data from the Surgeon General's report in May of last year, the time we spend with friends, on average, is down 70% in the last 2 decades. If this applies to you, you spend 2/3 less time with your friends, face-to-face. 49% of Americans have 3 or fewer close friends. What? And by the way, loneliness isn't good for you in terms of health. Speaking as a physician and an officer of public health, if you identify as lonely, your risk of heart attack and stroke goes up 33%. Your risk of major depression goes up 50%. Your risk of hospitalization goes up about 70%. So what was the matter with the old regime in France? Basically this. People looked to an external, centralized authority for what to think and what to do. From Tocqueville's point of view, that is poison to democracy. Who's that? Give you a hint. She's Indiana University's most recent Nobel Prize winner. 2009. It's Elinor Ostrom, Lynn Ostrom, the first woman ever to win the economics Nobel Prize, whether the economics prize is really a Nobel Prize. She's the first woman to win it. She was not even an economist. The first person to win the Nobel Prize who was not an economist. Lynn Ostrom said, it turns out that if government thinks it needs to solve the problems of the people, it can have disastrous results. She looked at the tragedy of the commons, fishing waters, grazing pastures. She determined we can actually work out the appropriate allocation of those resources on our own. We don't need people from FEMA to come in and tell us how they ought to be divided and enforce that. Now, certainly Lynn didn't think that was true in every case, but that's the direction in which her scholarship would draw us. I remember a visit of French dignitaries to the city of Indianapolis. We went to a homeless shelter, a shelter for battered women, an HIV/AIDS clinic. Great visits. The French delegation was very impressed. At the end of the day, they asked this question. The leader of the delegation said, "Excuse me, this is all very good, but who authorizes this?" Doesn't sound like much, but on that hinges the fate of a free culture and the free world. Who authorizes this? Do we need authorization to address our own problems and opportunities? Or might we be able to set to work on our own? So everybody recognizes, right? Please, sir, may I have some more from Charles Dickens. So this is from Bowling Alone. Basically, it turns out school performance, public health, crime rates, clinical depression, tax compliance, philanthropy, and so on are affected by how we connect with our family and friends and neighbors and coworkers. Where we are more connected, more embedded in relationships, doing more to bring our relationships and our fellow citizens and neighbors to life, the more healthy our communities are. Not only do we meet the challenge of opportunities, we also demonstrate much deeper resilience if associations are thriving. What's that image? Yeah, it's the Tower of Babel it's the Tower of Babel. Talk to the people who started Facebook. Sean Parker, the first president of Facebook. Talk about a transformative social media. The idea was to keep your eyes glued to the screen for ever-lengthening times. Likes as a way of delivering dopamine hits. That's not Heinter. That's the first president of Facebook talking. Sean Parker. They wanted you to self-administer dopamine hits so you continue to look at your screen. And what do you end up with? The polarization of community discourse. People simmering in outraged or polarized public. So now we come to the last text, the most recent one. Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death. So far as I know, the only text published in the last 50 years by an American academic that went on to become the album title for the British rock group Pink Floyd. Amusing Ourselves to Death. Postman was at NYU, founded the program in media ecology, and wrote 3 books that I again commend to your attention, the other 2 being Technopoly and the End of Education. Here's Neil Postman, obviously a staged photograph. But Postman said, like Marshall McLuhan before him, this is a variation, the medium is a metaphor. The 10 Commandments found in Exodus, Deuteronomy, prohibit the making of a graven image, right? The second commandment. Postman thought that's an indication that symbols powerfully shape our culture. And from his point of view, the Hebrew Bible is about a God of the Word, not a God of images. And Postman warns that we are shifting from a culture of word to a culture of image. And he thinks that might be a serious problem because our language, the symbols with which we communicate, powerfully influence how we think. The language, the medium through which we communicate. Remember, Lincoln-Douglas debates, 3 hours out in the open air. Average political soundbite of Donald Trump or Joe Biden or Barack Obama or George W. Bush, now down to about 7 seconds. The medium has a powerful effect on the message. It sequences it, frames it, enlarges or reduces it, and really creates our conception of what the world is really like. So there you see him again, George Orwell and Aldous Huxley, who had their pulse on the deepest threat to democracy. I think a lot of people would say, well, it was Orwell, and I hope everybody's familiar with 1984. Orwell feared those who would ban books. He feared that the truth would be concealed from us. He feared that we would be controlled by pain. It could be that Orwell had it right, but just consider the possibility that it was in fact Aldous Huxley, perhaps channeling the spirit of Alexis de Tocqueville, who had it right when he said, the real fear is that no one will want to read books. The real fear is that truth will be drowned out in a sea of irrelevance. The real fear is that we would not be controlled by pain, but by pleasure. Those self-administered dopamine hits that social media were designed to foster. We desperately need people to get together in rooms like this, for occasions like this, to sincerely talk with one another about our problems and opportunities and the creative community we'd like to leave for our children and our grandchildren. All right, I'm going to stop there and hope that this is provoked or evoked some questions or comments, which I hope we'll now have a chance to talk about. So if you have a question, please share. Yes, sir.
Would you say that part of the reason why we're so polarized is because with respect to social media? On social media, you will see the good or bad, and that's what it is. The people actually say things on Twitter and Facebook, they never even read say someone else's face.
I think that's a great point. And if you know the biography of Abraham Lincoln, after he died, his secretary, Joshua Speed, found in his top dress drawer a number of letters. He'd written to various people, but especially his general, George McClellan, who was a master of preparing the troops for battle, but would never take the troops into battle. This enraged Lincoln, and Speed found a bunch of letters that had been placed in envelopes and sealed, but Lincoln had written across the flap, signed and sealed, but never sent, because Lincoln knew that those letters would be radically different from a face-to-face conversation with McClellan. How many of us know that today? Many of us would say things over the phone we'd never say in person. Many of us would say things over email we'd never say in real time over the phone. And many of us would say things on social media where our very identity might be concealed that we wouldn't say in other contexts. So I think that's a huge problem. You remember Marshall McLuhan, the Canadian media theorist, the medium is the message. Once we start communicating with one another, primarily via electronic means, particularly instant messaging and so forth, the very nature of our interchange tends to change radically. There's no more shame, no more personal risk. I can just fly off the handle, swing from the heels, without fear perhaps of even being recognized, let alone suffering recrimination. So I'm not suggesting we ban social media, but we need thoughtful people who care about the future of democracy to be asking hard questions about social media and doing what we can to ensure that the next generations of Hoosiers and Americans get more information from places like books and less information from places like Facebook or Instagram or Twitter and so forth. I'll pin the back and then we'll compete. Yes, sir.
I just want to ask everybody, let's give you a round of applause. And I just have a couple of quick comments, less questions, and they'll be quiet. First of all, Lincoln, you're 100% right. Put those letters in the drawer. McClellan thought when Lincoln was face-to-face with McClellan, he never said those things either. This is kind of interesting. The other thing is that regarding the newspapers that Tocqueville highlighted, and I completely agree that they deserve highlight, they in many ways were as innovative in their era as this was. That was the big innovation of those newspapers in the 1830s, that those newspapers were all extraordinarily partisan.
Yes.
None of them pursued the truth. None of them pursued anything remotely looking like objectivity. So in that sense, we would feel very at home with reading a Democratic newspaper from 1830 or a Whig newspaper from 1835. So we should take a little bit of comfort from the fact that we'd have a lot to talk about in common with a lot of the Americans from the near. I'll be quiet. Thank you.
That's a great comment, and it has to be said. I said the Lincoln-Douglas debates were reproduced in newspapers all over the country, verbatim and in toto. Not quite. The Democratic leading newspapers published texts which favored Douglas's points of view. The Republican newspapers tended to express things in a way that favored Lincoln. But here's an essential contrast. Debate and dialogue. Debate comes from the French dialectic meaning to back and forth, like a tennis match or ping pong or something. I was a high school debater. The mission was to win. You didn't know which side of the question you would argue. In a sense, it didn't matter what the truer, the rightful position was. the question was, could you prevail? I think we live in a society dominated by debate. The other possibility is dialogue, right? Plato said, if I could have written down what I know, I would have, but I couldn't, so I wrote these instead. He wrote dialogues. Dialogue meaning through speech, through conversation. Plato's notion, the Socratic notion, was that through conversation, we could all emerge winners. Our mission was not to defeat each other. Our mission was to try to move all of us closer to the truth, understanding what's really happening and what needs to be done about it. And I think that's a model that's as applicable and as needed today in the 21st century as it was in the 5th century BCE in ancient Athens. We need to revive, show the young people in your life what a really good conversation looks like. Let them observe it at first and then invite them to join you. If we don't do that, democracy's goose, from Tocqueville's point of view, may be cooked. We've got to show young people what a really good conversation looks like. Yes, sir.
Yeah, when you were speaking about the old regime in France, was that before or after the revolution as far as what sort of mentality were in this?
Well, as you know, France had many revolutions, but I think of the one, in the late 18th century, the director of it, Charles Dickens, and so forth, Tale of Two Cities. Tocqueville thought deeply about that and concluded that the people in France were unable to govern themselves post-revolution because they had not developed the habits, a can-do attitude, an impulse to turn to the person next to them, to their neighbors, rather than to a central authority. So if you don't have something better in place for after the revolution, as we've seen and again throughout world history, the revolution often leaves people a great deal worse off. And that's certainly what Tocqueville thought about what most of us would refer to as the French Revolution. Please, Rick.
Richard, I second Dan's vote of thanks. That was outstanding. What did Tocqueville in his travels around the U.S. find that brought people together in association? In the heat of battle in the trenches, we tend to bind together, but affluenza made atomization you're talking about. So what are the lessons that he found the impetus for natural associations to grow?
It's a problem, maybe, if we live in gated communities, if we, have gated driveways, if we never see our neighbors, that's a kind of self-imposed isolation on some things. But Tocqueville thought, and this may sound silly, but I think he really believed it, one of the best things that can happen in our communities, in our neighborhoods, a tree falls across the road. A big pothole opens on the street down the block. What do we do about it? Well, call the people whose job it is to come and fix it. If that's our only impulse, we're in trouble. From Tocqueville's point of view, we need to turn to each other and tackle some of those problems on our own. That's not to say, we can prepare for national defense with a variety of neighborhood-based militias, at least not entirely. But there are lots of problems. I remember after Hurricane Katrina, some nice people in a very rural town in Louisiana, disaster. Everybody was flooded out of house and home. They actually self-organized. They turned the fire station into a daycare and a distribution center for clean water and diapers and so forth. Then days or weeks down the line, the people from FEMA show up and say, we don't need you people. The pros from Dover are here. We've got MBAs and PhDs and fancy titles in the United States government. You amateurs go home and let the pros take care of it. Now, again, I'm not saying we don't need FEMA, but we definitely don't need a centralized government stepping on the toes of neighbors and citizens who are doing their level best to address some of the problems we face in our own neighborhoods. Please.
There's Utah Fly argued heatedly with each other. They would argue, and they didn't take it personally, but when they had a problem, they examined it from all angles. Sometimes they would wake up the next morning and one would take the position of the other. It suggests that if you want to succeed in life, if you're fortunate enough to find someone who will argue effectively with you and really work out the problem, you'll do better.
It's a great point. What's the name of the great cancer hospital in New York City?
Sloan Kettering.
Who was Alfred P. Sloan? Among other things, Alfred P. Sloan was the chairman of the board of General Motors. And it said when the board of General Motors considered a resolution and nobody spoke in opposition to it, Alfred P. Sloan would say, "Gentlemen, it appears we haven't given this item sufficient thought. We shall table it and return to it at our next meeting." In other words, Sloan didn't want any decisions made that didn't at least receive some well-considered opposition. He believed the truth was more likely to come into view when a variety of perspectives were expressed. And, given the echo chamber of social media, that's probably an opportunity we need as much today as human beings have ever needed it. If we all live in our own echo chambers, according to John Stuart Mill, remember on Liberty, if all we know is our own position, then we don't really know anything about the matter of any question. So yeah, I agree absolutely. Kata.
It just occurred to me that I used to talk loud enough that you can hear me. Most of us here probably lived lives before the phones and the computers and all that, the Martha. And for us, hearing you talk about Huxley and about Tocqueville, we remember times when conversation was what you did around dinner table. It's what you did at school. I think about children in the last 30 years. I see my friends' grandchildren who go on road trips, and there are TV in the car. Nobody says, "I stopped on the lawn," or I see, there's no habit, and that's terrifying because it's the loss of what has been known. You talk about reading the old books, and reading the old. Wow, they had no idea what the old books are, but their parents now don't have any idea what the old books are. So, it's like somebody is going to have to reinvent this wheel over and over and over again. And that scares the big cats.
Yeah, I could. What's widely regarded as the greatest work in the history of philosophy by perhaps the most influential human being who ever lived, at least by experts at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle, I'm paraphrasing here, says you become what you habitually do. To which I would add, you become what you habitually think and feel. You become what your heart is set. What is the effect of Facebook or Instagram or any social media you care to name, Twitter certainly, now X? What is the effect of those media on the message that young people are receiving as regards what's most worth doing, what's most worth thinking about, and what's most appropriate to feel. I think it's a real problem. And I want to point out another idea. What's the word for eating together? It's commensalism. Co means together, mensa means table. So commensalism means sharing a table. The rate at which Americans share tables, both at work and at home, has plummeted over the last 40 years. Most of us now eat most of our meals alone. If the dinner table is one of the niduses around which conversations usually form, and we have essentially taken the dinner table out of family life, we're reaping what we're sowing. I think a lot of young people today would say, family dinner, gathering around the table, spending 60 or 90 minutes just talking with each other. What are you, nuts? What a waste of time. I got things to do right here on my phone. I can't afford to waste time on this. There are others waiting. Catherine, is it Bree? Okay.
Expanding on what you said that Aristotle, he also said that's what is a habit,
Yep.
not an act.
Yeah, the Greek word is hexis, that we basically recreate ourselves in tiny ways every day, but over weeks, months, years, and decades in very, very profound ways. Do you spend your time with Twitter or with Tocqueville? I'm not suggesting you should shun either one, but perhaps we don't have the balance just right. And perhaps there's something a lot of us could do to right that balance. John.
Hey, Rich, thank you for coming to echo a lot of the comments. You talk about Tocqueville's theory about a government. The state of Florida just passed a law that children under the age of 16 will not be exposed to social media. So where government is coming in to try to solve this. What do you think about that?
That's fascinating, and it really gives me the creeps. The idea that a government would prohibit people from communicating with each other by any medium. That doesn't mean what I think about it is right, but that makes me very nervous. Perhaps what we need to do as youth soccer coaches, Boys and Girl Scouts leaders, Sunday school teachers, volunteers in the public and parochial schools and so forth, perhaps what we need to do is our level best to give young people an alternative that would attract them. I believe human beings are still of such a nature that we would be drawn in to really good conversation and the opportunity to work together toward a shared goal. That rolling up our sleeves, working shoulder to shoulder with one another, accomplishing something we care about would still be so meaningful to us that it could, if not entirely overcome, at least dramatically shift the balance between voluntary association and whatever it is that happens on social media. Please.
Well, hey, sir. And then I wanted to share two quick things. Driving it this morning, I'm listening to Fat Sports Talk Radio, and one of the hosts was talking about a good neighbor who had put a big sign out by his sidewalk, with an arrow pointing to it, and they spent probably 2 minutes of their time, very valuable, talking about how incredible is it that guy would do that to notify people he doesn't even know and save them from blowing the tire out. I think that goes to the heart of what we're talking about tonight. Second thing, I want to do a quick poll. I'll be honest, I'm 67. In the last 10 years, I can't tell you how many texts or phone calls or conversations I've had with high school and college friends saying, remember when we read 1984 and we thought it was fiction?
Yeah, I have an observation. You're talking about relationships. I'm a retired physician also. I don't know if you're retired or not. What I found the biggest thing is find out where he's there. At first, let the person say, "You're used to it." I would start with they had parents there. Instead of the parents talk, I would talk to the athlete who was good and say, "Can you introduce these people? Who are they?" And I find it's kindness is the easiest thing in the world. It has to start with respect. And I think too many people are so self-centered. And you have a good title, but you don't have to live there. And then you have kids that come over. We had 4 kids. And so you get to know these kids. And you would show them you if you had to. But I think that starts with a simple thing. Instead of saying what you feel, say what you know, does not be hard on the other person. I just think, well, we talk a lot about this, but Lincoln was kind.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, the kindness of Lincoln and other important leaders. I don't think we're going to make much progress by ostracizing or despising or demonizing young people. You know, what's the world coming to? It's going to hell in a handbasket. Woe is me. We have to see them with respect, with kindness, with a sincere desire to draw out of them the best that's in them. That's the only spirit at which I think will be effective. If we go in saying you poor young people are lost, you're hopeless, we'll never get anywhere. But if we have real respect and genuinely want them to flourish as human beings and members of communities, then great things are possible. By the way, if you ever want to read another book that would help you think along these lines, let me commend The Death and Life of Great American Cities by Jane Jacobs. The Dance of the Sidewalk. People paying attention to what happens on their block. That may sound silly, but porches have largely disappeared from the architectural plans of single-family dwellings. And, there might be something Steve Goldstedt, for example, there might be something to be said for porches, front porches, and the kind of, I don't want to say surveillance, but taking an interest in what's happening on the block and gathering on front porches with our neighbors. That's a little thing, but paying attention to that kind of thing can turn out to mean a lot. I can tell you today, a lot of doctors' lounges are disappearing from new hospitals. We don't want the medical staff getting together to talk to each other. They should be in the ICU or the operating room or the outpatient clinic, generating revenue, increasing throughput. You destroy the sense of professional community, camaraderie, esprit de corps in a medical staff. You've got physicians who are much easier to manage and even to manipulate, but you've also got people taking a much lower degree of fulfillment in their work and often burning out precisely because they feel isolated and ignored. Please.
Well, thank you, Donna Richard. When I first stepped to Toby Malachi, found the executive chair of Malachi Worldwide, head of the policy at Best in Development. When I first met him, we just talked, and I said, Indiana has very bright, intelligent, smart people. I was referring to you, so I'm glad the Holy Spirit gave you that memory. I'm also a senior fellow at the St. Moore Institute. Tocqueville actually knew my mother, Frances G. Malachi. I'm from Collegeville, Indiana, originally. I was raised, you didn't say nothing. So growing up, we were quiet. And that's how she kept her boys, my brother, in line. So he taught me back then. And we kind of missed that a little bit. But from a brother's perspective, Hussey's talked about fear no one would read books. Kepsler talked about that. If you come to my humble abode in Carmel, my home in Washington, D.C., I'm in Black System at 7, St. White House Street. I'm invited to on trade. China and free trade agreements. I'm a insatiable reader. I love to read. But black in slavery times, which we go back some time, blacks were allowed to do that. And so we were prevented from, but they were prevented from doing that. And I encourage people to read. Well, that is, to say that. My question is that I agree with Mr. Ennis, back here, we were on the second question to this as well, is that there's an author, Abdul and I talked about it, Carl, just a month ago, spoke about the soul of stability. And maybe be a little bit more on that in our society today. But the White House has asked me to go speak in Belgrade, Ireland, April 4th, and then Montreal, Canada, in May 15 and 16. As a little bit of diplomat, if I can do that there, why can't I do that in Indianapolis or Indiana?
Yeah. I just want to point out that in Tocqueville's day, the time he visited the United States of America is thought to have the highest literacy rate that had been achieved in human history. These Americans were readers. That's one reason so many newspapers flourished. And, we could do a lot by improving our reading diet. We worry a lot about, the carbohydrates, the protein, the lipids, the vitamins, minerals, micronutrients you consume. You've heard the phrase from Ludwig Feuerbach, you are what you eat, right? So eat wisely so you can be healthy. Guess what? That applies not only to the gastrointestinal system, but to the visual system. Be careful what you read. If you really want to flourish as a human being, make the investment necessary to read well. Read books like the ones we talked about tonight, and other books, and share them with people. Draw other people into conversation about those books. The best books really can't be read in isolation. If you want to read Leo Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, the plays of Shakespeare, Dante's Divine Comedy, the Greek tragedies, Plato's dialogues, you've got to read them with at least one other person with whom you can talk about them. Read those kind of books and draw at least one human being in the conversation about them, and you will be taking a giant step toward correcting the problems that Tocqueville so brilliantly diagnosed. Please.
Hey, Dr. Gunderman, thank you so much for being here. This has been fantastic. And in the reading of Tocqueville, there was a phrase that stood out to me, and I'd like to read that phrase and read the sentence and make a comment on it in a skill question. The phrase was the reciprocal influence of men upon one another. And the sentence in which that was stated was the feelings and opinions are recruited, the heart is enlarged, and the human mind is developed by no other means than the reciprocal influence of men upon each other. One of the reasons that stood out to me is one of the concerns that I have about social media is we're reducing those reciprocal relationships to a 2D dimension rather than a 3D dimension. And that feels like we're taking the flow out of it and depriving people of humanity. And so my questions are, what are your thoughts regarding what's lost in reciprocity? And in addition to that, are we actually robbing each other of our souls, our sense of connection? What impact does that have on the future?
Great questions. I'm tempted to talk about the greatest coach in the history of American sport, but I'm going to go in a different direction and talk about the second greatest coach in the history of American sport, which is, according to ESPN, the Sporting News, and Sports Illustrated, and who's the second greatest coach in the history of American sport? The answer is Vince Lombardi. You win the Super Bowl, you get the Lombardi Trophy. Somebody once asked Vince Lombardi, why were the Green Bay Packers the greatest team in the history of professional football? Lombardi said other coaches know X's and O's better than I do. X's and O's? Hooks and yeses. Yeah. What did he mean? Yeah, diagramming plays, right? The X is defense, the O is offense. Other coaches know more than I do about strategy and tactics. Lombardi said that there's one thing I know better than those other coaches: the hearts of my football. Why were the Green Bay Packers the greatest team? in the history of American football. This is Lombardi's answer. Big tough guy, one of the 7 blocks of granite of the Fordham University offensive line. Big, 5'8", 180 leg weight. Maybe not so big, but, outsized influence on the field. They asked Lombardi, why were the Packers the greatest team ever? His answer, because they loved each other. The reciprocal influence. Every player on that team at Lombardi's was there to bring out the best in the other players on that team. Maybe you've heard of the Packers sweep. Basically, 11 players had to act as one. A failure by a single player could undo the work of the other 10. They were there not for individual glory, but to bring out the best in the team. And I think that's a powerful message about the reciprocal influence of people on people. We need to bring out the best in each other. Mission number 1 is not to shine as brightly as I can. Mission number 1 is to help others. In my case, students at Indiana University or future physicians to shine as brightly as they can, not as individuals only, and maybe not even primarily, but members of teams. Healthcare, for example, is no longer a solo sport. Healthcare in the 21st century is a team sport. Our young doctors have to be good at working on teams and helping to lead teams. And that's exactly, I think, what Tocqueville had in mind when he talked about the reciprocal influence of human beings on one another. We're not here to get as much as we can for ourselves. We're here first and foremost to summon forth the best in our friends and neighbors and colleagues. If we all go forth with that sort of a purpose in our hearts, I think we can do a lot to revive our neighborhoods and our communities, perhaps the nation, and even be of service to humankind.
So I have to ask, who was best coach? Johnny Wooden?
Yeah, the best coach in the history of American sport, again, according to Sports Illustrated, the Sporting News, and ESPN, is John Wood.
John Wood.
Won 10 NCAA championships for the UCLA men's girls basketball team. Let me tell you something about that. Phil Walton once said, maybe the best or second best player Wood never coached at UCLA. Bill Walton said, Coach Wood never talked about winning and losing. He never talked about how many points somebody scored, how many rebounds they pulled down, how many assists they lost. Coach Wood didn't even talk about basketball. Now get that. The greatest coach in the history of American sport didn't talk about sports. What did he talk about? Coach Wooden talked about becoming a good person. This is Bill Walton's words, not mine. Coach Wooden talked about becoming a good person because he believed if you became a good person, you stood a chance of becoming a good basketball player. It all hinges on what's first, what's topmost in our vision of the kind of family and community we're trying to create. And John Wooden was a master creator of friendships and communities. 2 years before he died, he knew where all but 4 of the players, 15-man roster, all but 4 of the players on his championship teams, where they lived, their marital status, how many kids they had, what profession they were pursuing. And by the way, Wooden was 97 years old. For him, coaching was not the college days alone. He was forming relationships that he believed were for a lifetime. And that's the kind of scale, the time frame on which we need to be investing in one another.
Well said. First of all, on that show is
I see that Danny has led the field. What's that about? That won't mean a lot to everybody, but what people will.
Social media is huge. I don't see it the way. All of a sudden, it's self. I guess the question what hope really is there in these? Yes, interactions here will actually have that move on. That said, or that's and then it's not all saying you get it. Some of them, as we read our newspapers online, want the jury's clear, cons, very old, can't be. So I guess, what do you personally hope the direction will take?
Yeah, I don't know if I conveyed this accurately, but I am profoundly hopeful. And I don't consider myself pessimistic on this point, but we do have a big challenge. And I think part of the answer is, what can each of us do, ideally, as a member of a team of 2 or more people, to provide an alternative to what is currently the default setting of spending hours every day at 65 days a year staring at our cell phones. Could you, I don't know, could you use Socrates? Could you tutor a student struggling with reading? Could you get involved in the Boys of the Girl Scouts? Could you teach Sunday school? I don't know what the media, what the forum would be, but we can't afford to sit in our easy chairs and bemoan our fate. We need to take action, and I believe it's within the ability of nearly every one of us, I'm guessing, to take some action, not to call for legislation, but simply to take action in our own backyards and make a difference in a very local way. Every great change begins with the action of one person. And if we can get a lot of one persons acting in the same direction, I think we can have a profound effect on the future. I got to tell you, people, Socrates, in one of Plato's dialogues, bemoans the invention of the written word. He thinks the written word is going to be the death of humanity. Then we get books and literacy, later newspapers, and then radio, and then television, and then the internet and social media. People have always been bemoaning, forecasting the end of humanity, the end of the world as we know it. Somehow we've managed to persist. That's not to say we should be complacent, but if each one of us takes some action, however modest, I think the cumulative effect, it's not only going to be the sum of its parts, it's going to be greater than the sum of its parts. And it matters how you vote. Tocqueville said that's number 10 on the list of the 10 most important things the citizen in democracy. There are 9 more important things than casting a ballot or who you vote for, and that has to do with your capacity to foster the interchange of ideas, to build interpersonal relationships, and build community. If we can do that, we create the kind of souls of democracy, the kind of associations on which democracy must be based, that makes it possible for a democracy to thrive. It just doesn't, you couldn't implant the Declaration, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights in Afghanistan or Iraq and expect it to take root and flourish. From Tocqueville's point of view, it's the character of the people, finally. That's the real foundation on which democracy rests. What can we do to enhance the character of our fellow citizens and neighbors? And in so doing, it's not like pure sacrifice that's going to make us miserable or ruin them. We and they are actually going to be more likely to flourish if we take that kind of action. We can actually feel better about our lives and the contributions we've made over the course of our lives if we take this kind of action in our own local communities. Yes, sir.
I suggest we can start by recognizing when we're having addictive behavior with our social media. At the other place we'd start is turn the darn thing off. For about 4 hours a day. We deal with Wall Street students at the master's level of communication information sciences. We tell the students that turn the phone off, get interaction with other people, because if I succeed, that's what you're going to have to learn.
Yeah, I mean, everybody knows that if you want to succeed in the sports world, physical training is absolutely necessary. You know, if you're an endurance athlete, maybe you need to swim or bike or run long distance. If you're a strength athlete, maybe you need to lift increasingly heavy weights. The exact same thing is true with our minds and our character. They are only strengthened by stretching. And it's hard to read Tocqueville. A 12-year-old, a 17-year-old, a 22-year-old is going to find it very difficult to read Tocqueville. And that's not entirely their fault. That's partly our fault. But if we can draw them into that text over time, help them understand the ideas that are circulating through that text and how they're relevant to their own lives, they can be drawn. And they can emerge from a text like that much more insightful and deeply thoughtful about the challenges they'll face as citizens of our democracy. And that's just a price we have to be willing to pay. I get to spend much of every day in classroom or learning environments with students, and I can tell you, if this is done well, and if the gods are smiling on you, you get to see people leaning forward in their seats. You get to see a light come on behind people's eyes. You get to see them thrown into vigorous dialogue about subjects they've awakened to and become intrigued by. And that is what's real. You know, sometimes I get to make life-saving diagnoses, help restore somebody to health. It is equally fulfilling to awaken somebody from what's called a social media-induced slump and see them really encounter a text in conversation with fellow learners. It is a revelation and a joy to be one of it, and I recommend it to you.
Sure, we're finished?
No, I don't.
Any more questions? More that. Well, thank you. Thank you, Richard. Inspiring episode. See that they will you going back to the step by what was said just closing, and that is you would awake. And that's part of what this Remnant Trust idea of the Risk Trust is all about. Using the work that you see here are adult election, because that's about 16 or 17 about, and then it's the court. It gets about what's it, what's the court. It serves as a main election name to have this conversation, non-otherwise. Here's to, I think, a way will give people involved like that have a lot, not right, do a way to them, inspire them, the importance of these ideas, how they can impact their life, thinking, and their.
I got to respond to that with gratitude. I don't want you to think I'm full of crap. On Tuesdays, except today, I go to a senior living community on the northeast side of Indianapolis called Barrington. There are about 160 residents there. For 90 minutes every week, no credits awarded, no tuition is collected, nobody's progressing toward a degree, nobody's making a career. The average participant is about 85 years old. There's a couple that's been married for 68 years, a couple that's been married for 67 years, a couple that's been married for 64 years. Just to give you some sense of who is there. There are about 35 people. We get together once a week for 90 minutes. Most recently, we read Leo Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. People were thinking about what it was like to experience the death of their parents, what it was like to experience the birth of their children, what their marriage was like, what their courtship was like. I could go on. By the way, right now we're reading a book by a living American author, one of the living American authors I'm convinced will most likely to be reading 100 years from now. She's in Iowa, Marilyn Robinson. The book is Gilead. And what I said about seeing people leaning forward, drawn into the conversation, deeply engaged in dialogue, seeing lights come on behind eyes, that happens reliably every week at the Barrington. By golly, it could happen at your village, or maybe in your faith community, or maybe in a high school club in your neighborhood. You know, these opportunities are available to all of us. And somehow, for me at least, doing it in a context where no money is changing hands only, to me, represents a pure working of it. Nobody's there except because they love me. And they keep showing up week after week because they love reading these great works of literature and having a chance to talk about them together. Those people are now in community with each other in a way they had never been simply as residents of the Barrington. What if that could happen at most of the neighborhoods here in Indianapolis, in central Indiana? I believe it could. I gotta shut up. Sorry.
Well, maybe not. That makes me think about the notion that you should get into those high school laws, or this associations at that level, or at any level. The trust would be support, and would find ways to bring these books to that kind of discussion, and about that maybe help inspire some deep thinking of the ideas. So I think right next to an end. We're pretty close to on time to start it. I want to thank you all again, and I have to do my duty on the table stands. We say we appreciate your support. Being here tonight is tremendous support for the Remnant Trust and its efforts to get this good ideas shared and open dialogue. You can use the QR code, or you can go on our website and extend that support if you're so inclined, and we could be at the end. We should give that effort. Richard, thank you. This has been an inspiring, and I think will be leading some ideas and some thoughts. So thank you very much. Again, let's say, extend each of the world. Thank you.